Spain is not running like a motorcycle. It is flying like a rocket. That is what the Spanish Prime Minister said in May of 2024 while bragging about the country's economic growth. Months later, many international outlets echoed the message. Reuters, The Guardian, Bloomberg, and France 24 praised Spain's performance, and some macroeconomic indicators even placed the country at the top of the European Union and the developed world. But is that really true? Is Spain actually flying like a rocket? And if it is, what explains this growth? That is exactly what we are going to break down today. So sit back and let's get started. First, we need to understand what Sanchez meant when he said the Spanish economy was taking off. He was referring to GDP, which grew 3.5% in 2024. But what does that actually mean? We hear the term all the time. Yet what exactly is GDP? And is a growth of 3.5% a big deal? GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product, and it represents the total value of all final goods and services produced within a country over a certain period of time, usually 1 year. It is one of the key measures used to evaluate how healthy a nation's economy is. To understand it more simply, imagine a small town with 3 businesses, a bakery, a clothing shop, and a cafe. In 1 year, the bakery sells bread and pastries for 500,000 euros. The clothing shop sells garments for 700,000 euros. The cafe sells drinks and food for 300,000 euros. If we add everything together, the town's GDP would be 1,500,000 euros. That number would be the town's economic output and can be compared with previous years to see whether the economy is growing or shrinking. In Spain's case, we can say that economic activity has grown compared to the previous year, but GDP is not the only indicator that matters. There are other crucial metrics like the deficit and public debt. So how is Spain performing in those areas? If we look at the deficit, the government is still spending more than it earns. The deficit stands at 2.8% of GDP, which is lower than expected. This, however, has pushed public debt higher in absolute terms, reaching 1.621 trillion euros. But the picture is not entirely negative. Since Spain's GDP has grown more than its debt, even though the debt continues to climb, it now weighs less relative to the size of the economy. It has fallen from the 125% recorded in 2019 to 101.8% today. In other words, Spain is generating more income because it is selling more goods and services. That is the GDP growth. But part of that growth is being financed with borrowing, which means public debt. As long as economic growth stays above the pace at which debt accumulates, the relative weight of the debt decreases, which makes it more sustainable in the long run. Now that we understand what GDP is, let's take a look at whether Spain's 3.5% growth is a big deal or not. And the short answer is yes, it is. If we compare Spain with the Eurozone, Spain wins by a huge margin. The Eurozone as a whole did not even reach 1% growth in 2024. Spain grew more than France and Italy, which did not even make it to 1%. It grew more than the United States, which reached 2.8%. And it grew miles ahead of what used to be Europe's economic engine, Germany, whose GDP actually shrank by 0.2% in 2024. And here is something even more striking. If we compare the growth of Spain and Germany since the 2008 financial crisis, Spain has now grown more overall, even though Germany recovered much faster after that crisis. The only European economy of a similar size that grew more than Spain was Lithuania, and Spain did all of this while dealing with the Dana floods, which, according to the Bank of Spain, knocked 0.2 percentage points off GDP growth. On top of that, analysts expect Spain to continue outpacing the Eurozone in the coming years. While Eurozone countries are expected to grow 0.9% in 2025 and 1.2% in 2026, Spain's GDP is expected to grow 2.7% in 2025 and nearly 2% in 2026. So we now know Spain is growing faster than the rest of Europe, and that this is usually a good sign because it means more economic activity. But why? What exactly is driving this growth? The first thing we need to talk about is obvious: tourism. In 2024, Spain received around 94 million international tourists, 12% more than in 2019, and not only that, tourism contributed 6.5% more to the economy than in 2023. That adds up to more than 200 billion euros per year, which is enormous and explains about 26% of Spain's GDP growth. Put simply, roughly one quarter of Spain's 3.5% GDP increase comes directly from tourism. And if we compare tourism's weight in Spain with neighboring countries like France or Italy, it becomes even clearer. Tourism accounts for about 10% of Italy's GDP and roughly 7 or 8% of France's. In Spain, it is even more dominant. And although tourism is great for economic growth, it does have drawbacks, like overdependence on foreign spending, overcrowded cities, and exposure to global shocks that can suddenly reduce travel. Another major factor is immigration. From January 2022 to October 2024, the population of Spain increased by 1.5 million people. This rise was not because of the Spanish-born population, which only grew by 230,000 people. The real driver was the arrival of more than 1.2 million foreigners. As a result, the foreign-born population rose from 11% to 13.8% of the country. A large share comes from Latin America, which has helped integration enormously because of the shared language and cultural similarities. This has avoided many of the social tensions seen in other European countries. This demographic shift boosted the labor force. People of foreign origin now have one of the highest employment participation rates in the entire European Union. This has had a huge impact on job creation and overall economic activity. 40% of all new jobs created between 2022 and 2024 were filled by foreign workers, especially in hospitality, commerce, construction, and agriculture. This also means GDP growth can be misleading. When more people arrive and start working, the economy naturally grows. But what matters for citizens is their personal income. To measure that, we look at GDP per capita, which is simply GDP divided by the number of inhabitants. And how is Spain doing there? Pretty well, although not as spectacularly. GDP per capita grew 2% in 2024, above the European average, but below inflation. So even though the economy is expanding faster than the European Union as a whole, Spanish households have slightly less purchasing power because prices rose more quickly. The downside of both tourism and immigration is that they make Spain's housing crisis even worse. On one hand, the boom in tourism has made vacation rentals far more profitable than long-term rentals, so many property owners have switched from one to the other. This reduces the available supply of housing for residents and pushes prices up, especially in cities like Madrid, Barcelona, and many coastal areas. On the other hand, if Spain's population keeps rising due to immigration, the demand for homes will keep climbing. And if supply does not grow at the same pace, prices soar. That is exactly what is happening today. Another key factor is energy. In 2023, Spain became the first major European country to generate more than 50% of its electricity from renewable sources, thanks to a boom in wind and solar energy. Beyond this leadership in renewables, Spain also has something extremely valuable: liquefied natural gas regasification plants. What do these plants do? LNG is transported by ship in liquid form because it takes up far less space. Once it arrives, the regasification plants heat it back into gas so it can be used by homes and industries. Spain has 6 plants, the most in Europe. This gave Spain a major strategic advantage during the energy crisis caused by the collapse of Russian gas supplies. Spain was one of the least affected countries in Europe. These two factors are behind two major milestones. First, since 2021, Spain has gone from being a net importer of energy to a net exporter. And second, Spain now enjoys much cheaper electricity than countries like Germany or Italy. In 2024, the price of electricity after taxes was about 0.24 euros per kilowatt hour in Spain, compared with 0.36 in Italy and 0.39 in Germany. The difference is enormous. In summary, Spain is growing at an impressive pace, far above the European average. This growth is driven mainly by booming tourism, an expanding labor force thanks to immigration, a strong commitment to renewable energy, and world-class LNG infrastructure. But important challenges remain, especially the housing crisis and the need to keep reducing public debt. And now it is your turn. Will Spain become the new economic engine of Europe? Will it be able to solve the housing and debt problems? Let us know in the comments. That's all for today's video. You know the drill. If you